Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. I'm your host, Susan Huntley, and on behalf of the Calgary Buddhist Temple Sangha Engagement, I'd like to welcome you to today's timely and informative presentation called Awakening to the Climate Crisis, a Buddhist Perspective. To begin, could I please ask you to join me by putting your hands together in gassho to quiet our minds and reverently show our appreciation for this wonderful opportunity that brings us together. And if you could please repeat after me, Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Wonderful, thank you. So today's presentation is called Awakening to the Climate Crisis, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Ray Nakano. Ray is a retired third-generation Japanese-Canadian, born and raised in Hamilton, Ontario, along with his 4 younger sisters. He resides in Toronto, where he worked for the Ontario government for 28 years. Ray currently practices in 2 Buddhist traditions, Jodo Shinshu and that of Thich Nhat Hanh. For the past 3 years, Ray has been actively involved in the Climate Fest group with the website of climatefest.ca. He is committed to bringing awareness of our climate crisis to others. He has also created the myclimatechange.home blog website for tracking climate-related news, articles, reports, and organizations. I had the sincere pleasure of working with Ray when we both were on the board of directors for the Jodo Shinshu Buddhist Temples of Canada, so I can attest to his dedication and commitment. Without further ado, I am delighted to let Ray take over and share his knowledge and passion for climate action and concern about climate crisis from a Buddhist perspective. Take it away, Ray.
So welcome. Susan's already mentioned Awakening to the Climate Crisis, a Buddhist perspective. The purpose of my presentation is to look at our climate crisis from the perspective of someone who's very concerned about it, me, and from the perspective as a Buddhist. In doing the latter, I'll talk about the Four Noble Truths, I'll talk about the Noble Eightfold Path, as well as some other Buddhist teachings. I'll talk about the scientific facts of climate change, what Canada is doing about it, and what we can do and need to do both personally and politically to address it. As an engaged Buddhist, I believe we have the moral obligation to do what we can to address the suffering that our climate crisis is causing around the world. I hope my talk will motivate you to take action to address this greatest existential crisis of our time. So this is the outline of our program for this afternoon. Land acknowledgement, I'll do some housekeeping notes, the presentation itself, which should take about 40 to 45 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have about 25 minutes for the Q&A portion. So first I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. So I'm actually coming to you from Toronto. I acknowledge the land that I'm meeting with you on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And now it's the home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And you'll see that there's a link in the chat where you can actually determine whose land you're currently on. Housekeeping, just please respect each other and listen with an open mind. The presentation is being recorded. You should have heard a message when you signed on. This is an interactive presentation, meaning that Denise, I think her title is Tech Denise, will be sharing links in the chat that you can click on if you wish as I'm speaking. So when I talk about an organization, when I talk about a document, she'll be putting the link in the chat so you can actually click on it and look at it while I'm speaking. The other thing that we're doing is we have what we would call closed captioning. So if you click on, and it's different for different devices, and hoping that you're familiar with it, but if you click on either closed caption or sometimes there's a more icon with a ... If you click on that, if you see something that says show subtitle, then as I'm speaking, the subtitling or the closed captioning will show up at the bottom of your screen. Moving along with the rest of the housekeeping. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. Sharon, I think her label is Tech Sharon, will be collecting these for the Q&A portion at the end. And if you're having any problems at all, just send a chat or a private chat to Tech Sharon or Tech Denise, and they'll try to assist you. Please stay muted throughout this portion of the webcast, the presentation portion. And you may be asked to unmute in the Q&A portion to ask I guess a verbal question. And a copy of the slides that I'm presenting will be made available to those that have registered for this webcast. So just some background. Actually, Susan's pretty much given you my entire background. I think, I'm trying to remember now. She may not have mentioned that I'm married. I have 2 daughters, Samantha and Camille. Camille, the oldest, is married and has 2 kids. So my 2 grandkids, you can see their picture on the left. Gibson is 9 and Scarlett just turned 6. Susan mentioned I retired in 2011. In that same year, I was ordained into the Order of Interbeing, which was created by Thich Nhat Hanh. His picture's in the middle. And he passed away in January at the age of 95. And I'm also, as Susan had mentioned, I was the president of the Hamilton Buddhist Temple for 5 years. And I also sat on the board of the Jodo Shinshu Buddhist Temples of Canada for several years. I guess the third graphic that you can see, this is the Ipcc report that came out from the United Nations in 2018. Upon reading that report, I became very concerned about the environment and climate change. So I thought, what kind of world would my grandkids be faced with? So I decided then to dedicate my retirement to doing everything that I could to help address our climate crisis. And this presentation is in line with that. So I started doing research. I found so much information, like websites, organizations, reports, media articles, even YouTube videos. So I found I couldn't keep track of it all. So I decided to really organize that information into a website. And that's why I started up the website that Susan mentioned, myclimatechange.home.blog. And I believe Denise would have put the link in the chat. But if you go to that website, anything I've ever come across in terms of organizations, reports, videos, it's on that website. I actually post daily articles from the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail, any articles related to climate change, and any articles related to Indigenous issues. So if you're looking to catch up on what's happening in Toronto in relation to climate or Indigenous affairs, you can just go to my website and you'll find information there. I have volunteered with several environmental groups. Toronto Green Community was one of them, 350.org. Citizens Climate Lobby, actually I was involved with them for a little bit, and then Toronto 350. I currently volunteer with Climate Fast and climatefast.ca. I think the link's in the chat, and I've been with them for about 3 years now. So before the pandemic, I was involved in doing logistical support for our local Fridays for Future Toronto group, and they were planning rallies and marches. We actually had, I think it was September 29th, 2019, we had about 10,000 people in downtown Toronto. I was looking after the logistics for that particular rally. But since the pandemic, everything has basically been moved online. So we've had World Environment Day, we've had Earth Day, we've had a lot of climate-related workshops, meetings, webcasts, and I've been basically doing the technology for those through Zoom and YouTube live stream. So now I'm going to talk about the Four Noble Truths. And we're going to start with the first one is the truth. The truth is that we are in a climate crisis. People all around the world are suffering from drought, heat waves, wildfires, food and water insecurity, hurricanes, tropical storms, mudslides. We're currently on track for a 1.8 degree temperature increase. And that is if all the promises that were made at COP26 in Glasgow last year can be met. Currently, we are suffering from the effects of a 1.2 degree temperature increase. So if those promises that have been made at the COP26 are not met, and currently it's not clear to see that they are actually even progressing towards those goals that they had set. If it doesn't happen, we call it, what I call it is business as usual, or BUA, BAU. And we would basically be on track for about a 3 degree temperature increase. So we're working very hard to make sure that that increase is kept to 1.5 degrees. So here's what happened in Canada last year, and some of this will probably be familiar to you. In BC, we had the heat dome, and CBC reported that about 600 people died in BC that summer. More than 231 people died on June 29th alone. I think that was the peak of the heat dome. Here's a picture here of Lytton. I think Lytton reported the highest temperature in Canada, and then the day after that, the town burned down. This is just a picture of Abbotsford, but there was a lot of other areas within southern BC that were flooded. And I just added this graphic for Ottawa. Ottawa, was it 2 weeks ago now, but they had severe storms. In fact, parts of Ottawa are still without power even now. So it's moving. It's happening pretty much everywhere in Canada right now. So this chart illustrates how the carbon dioxide parts per million has been growing since 1960. And it has been increasing. Even in spite of all of the COPs, COPs is short for Conferences of the Parties, and they were basically sponsored by the United Nations. We had Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, the movie, if you remember, came out in 2006. It won 2 Academy Awards, but it hasn't changed our situation. We continue to see carbon dioxide parts per million grow. You notice that the line is jagged. So the fluctuations are because in the summertime, the CO2 level dips because we have vegetation in the northern hemisphere. And in the wintertime, the CO2 level increases. So that's why you see this zigzag. But it has been increasing since 1960. You can go to co2.earth, and it's a observatory in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and they report on the CO2 parts per million on a regular basis. Continuing, some more truths. Canada was the only one of the G7 countries whose greenhouse gas emissions actually went up. And it went up by 21% since 1990. We did worse than the United States, even while Donald Trump was the president. So Climate Tracker is an independent NGO, non-government organization that looks at the climate policies and actions of all countries in the world. They have rated Canada's climate policies and actions as highly insufficient. And you can take a look at that website. There's been some headlines concerning the current situation. There have been urgent messages from religious leaders and the United Nations. And the United Nations has actually announced a code red for humanity at this time. Continuing on. So when the UN Code Red Declaration came out, there were newspaper headlines in other parts of the world. You can see some of them here. Front page news, like big news. In Canada, not so much. I think Globe and Mail had its second page. Toronto Star had a couple of paragraphs about it. So there's a problem there, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The Lancet came out, which is a preeminent medical journal, and declared code red for a healthy future. Which brings us to the truth of the cause of our climate crisis. So here I'm going to talk about the 3 poisons: ignorance, attachment, and aversion. So the first one is ignorance. So most of us are not aware of how dire our situation is. We continue to burn fossil fuels and produce methane. We're not aware of how much we are destroying nature. We're not aware of how much our climate crisis is affecting others. Continuing, attachment. We overconsume, and we don't want to change the way that we live. And the third poison is aversion. So some of us are just ignoring the climate crisis, hoping it will go away or that someone else will look after it. We may be fearful of the climate crisis, we may feel helpless, or some of us may have given up. Which brings me to the truth of the end of our climate crisis. We know what needs to be done. We can reduce the most serious impacts of the climate crisis, but we need everyone to actively do something about it, including our elected representatives. So here I wanted to show you a portion of this video from Just Have a Think. You may not have heard of it, but let me stop this share. And I'm going to go to the video.
It's probably not a particularly fair or particularly helpful thing to do. The critical question is, what does the future hold and what do we need to do now? The IPCC makes it very clear that if we follow the current set of global climate mitigation policies, then our kids and grandkids will see an average global surface temperature increase of about 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that would mean more than 1 million species of animals and plants going extinct on land and in our oceans towards the end of the century, and more than 1 billion human climate refugees attempting to migrate from uninhabitable areas to somewhere they can actually survive, which may well lead to regional and international conflicts as 10 or 11 billion human beings all fight over a rapidly decreasing amount of livable space and an increasingly limited supply of edible food and drinkable water. To give ourselves a greater than 50% chance of avoiding that nightmare and limiting warming to the safe level of just 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, then global greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs, will have to reach their peak no later than 2025, say the IPCC. So that's less than 3 years from now. And the International Energy Agency just told us that global CO2 emissions went up by another 6% in 2021 as we all bounced back from COVID. So our trend line's not looking too encouraging right now. By 2030, less than 8 years from now, the world needs to achieve a 48% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions compared to 2019 levels to stay on target for 1.5 degrees of warming. By 2040, we're looking at an 80% decrease in CO2 to stay on the 1.5 degrees pathway, by which time we'll also need to have reduced methane emissions by 44% compared to 2019 levels. Is this looking challenging to you? Because it is to me. The slightly better news, according to the IPCC, is that there's a range of tangible actions we can take to stop the runaway freight train. They set out all these so-called mitigation options in a single chart, focused on what can actually be achieved by or before 2030. As well as the ability to be rapidly implemented this decade, the two other criteria that the IPCC apply are, number one, how big an impact will it have on the problem, and number two, how much will it cost?
So the situation is very challenging, needless to say. So that brings me to the path that leads to the end of our climate crisis. And I think you're all familiar with the Wheel of the Dharma, the Noble Eightfold Path. And I'm going to start with right mindfulness. So we know what to do. The International Energy Agency has laid out a pathway to net zero for Canada to follow with specific energy policy recommendations. Drawdown is a book written by Paul Hawken, and it provides 100 known solutions to our climate crisis. And there are various other think tanks and environmental organizations in Canada and outside of Canada that have developed action plans for governments and corporations to follow. The IPCC, United Nations, has just released their Mitigation of Climate Change report. Not adaptation, not how do you deal with the effects of climate change, but how to actually prevent climate change from getting worse. And here they specify what must be done to mitigate that climate change. The full report is 2,913 pages. They have a 64-page summary for policymakers. So now I wanted to talk about Canadian mainstream media. So I believe that mainstream media coverage is part of the problem. They don't report on the breadth and depth of climate disasters. So here I'm talking about our newspapers, the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, which I get daily. I'm also talking about CBC and CTV television. So right now, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay are reeling from historic heat waves with temperatures as high as 45 degrees centigrade. India and Pakistan are also experiencing the same. There's floods and landslides that have been caused by heavy rains in Sao Paulo, Brazil. 21 people died and left more than 600 families without homes. So there's a website you can go to called the Watchers website, and it will tell you all the extreme weather events that are taking place around the world. And if you start to look at that website, you'll just see how many, quote, natural disasters are taking place right now because of climate change. So Canadian mainstream media is reporting more than previously about our climate crisis. I think that was because of what happened in Western Canada and with the recent COP26 conference in Glasgow. But to me, the problem is they don't call it a crisis, and they don't associate the disasters that are with the causes of our climate crisis. The fact that we're continuing to burn fossil fuels, we're continuing to extract oil and gas for other countries to burn, and we continue to produce methane. So they don't really connect the dots. They talk about the disaster, but they don't talk about what's the cause behind it. So one of the things that occurs to me is that, well, mainstream media like CBC and CTV television, they sell advertising, and they need that to survive. And a lot of their sponsors are companies that sell gasoline, sell SUVs, sell trucks, sell flights, sell travel to foreign destinations. Is that the reason they don't connect the dots? I don't know. But it just seems, we're not getting the kind of coverage that I think is needed. So there are news media that you can follow. There are what I call independent news media outlets that do a very good job about reporting on the climate crisis. In Canada, you have Canada's National Observer, The Conversation, the Narwhal, the Tyee. Internationally, Britain's The Guardian has probably been the longest running news media site that's talked about climate change. And there's the Independent as well. So these media outlets depend on subscriptions and donations from their supporters. They don't advertise. So if you want news specifically related to the climate crisis, you can read The Energy Mix in Ottawa, which is produced by Mitchell Beer. And in the UK, it's called Carbon Brief. So these websites specifically report on climate change. That's all they're reporting on, right? So Energy Mix actually does a very good job because it tries to cover Canada-wide what's taking place and give their perspective on it. So there's also the BBC, which I find is actually very good as a national broadcaster. I think they do a lot better job on reporting on climate change than does the CBC. So next, just continuing here, there's some newsletters you can sign up for. And to their credit, CBC, I think CTV has one now too. They have climate newsletters. So you can actually sign up for those and get regular news reports. And next, right concentration and right view. So this is, I guess, a chain that we talk about in Thich Nhat Hanh tradition or Plum Village tradition. But mindfulness is taking all the information that you can from reputable sources, and then you think about that, you focus on it, you try to understand it. And that's what the concentration comes from. And once you've done that, then hopefully you have an insight where you better understand what is actually happening, and that just becomes part of your inner wisdom. So what do I understand with regard to our climate crisis? And I think I've already said it, is that we are in a climate crisis that's affecting the entire world. And this is interconnectedness, one of the eyes of Buddhism, because we are all interconnected. If people in developing countries have to burn coal, wood, peat moss, cow dung because that's the only means they have of keeping warm or cooking their food, that affects the same air that we breathe. So we are all suffering from the effects of our climate crisis whenever someone anywhere is burning fossil fuels, or anything else for that matter, anything that produces CO2. The other fact is that it's going to get worse. We are experiencing the effects of 1.2 degree temperature increase right now. It may not sound like much, but you look at what happened in Western Canada. The wildfires, the heat dome, the floods, and the extreme cold. So even the extreme cold is caused by the weakening of the El Nino wind. So can you imagine what a 1.8 degree temperature increase would look like? And yet, that's what we're faced with. And that's only if all the countries in the world can meet their promises and the declarations that they made at COP26. So we really need to limit the temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees. I guess the third point here is that Canada is not doing enough to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Point 4, are we treating the climate crisis like an emergency? I think the federal government did a pretty good job in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. They treated it. They treated the pandemic like an emergency. We had emergency funding for individuals and businesses. We had massive purchases of vaccines. We had rollouts. We had advertising. So we know the government is capable of doing, when it's an emergency, capable of dealing with that emergency. But why aren't we doing the same with our climate emergency? So we need urgent and drastic action, and we need it now. So that comes next to right thinking, and these are all the things that we could be doing or should be doing. And basically, I've mentioned stop burning fossil fuels. We need to electrify everything, our transportation, our heating. We need to lessen food waste. We need to stop deforestation. So there's a lot to be done. And this is just to describe the generation of electricity in Canada right now. And these are some numbers that I pulled off of one of the, I think it's a Canadian government website. But it talks about how much of our power is actually generated from fossil fuels. So Ontario took a big step when they got rid of all their coal-fired electricity generation. But Alberta is quite large. Saskatchewan, the same thing. Nunavut, I think basically they're relying on diesel for their electricity. The good news is, though, and I did some research on Alberta and on Calgary, is that Alberta will stop burning coal for power by 2023, 7 years ahead of schedule. So that's to the credit of the Alberta government. Next, I want to talk about right speech, which is continuing on the wheel of the Dharma. So Catherine Heiho is a Canadian born in Toronto. She's a scientist currently working at the University of Texas, and she's probably the most popular spokesperson on climate change in the United States. She was named one of the United Nations Champions of the Earth, and she says the most important thing you can do to fight climate change is talk about it. So here's a very short video clip.
How do I talk about climate change to my brother-in-law, my neighbor, my colleague, my coworker? I hear this question almost every single day. And usually people have given it a try and it hasn't gone so well. It's either ended in an argument or it's been so depressing you just want to go back to bed and pull the covers back over your head. Here's the thing. Climate change is scary, and it absolutely is depressing. I'm a climate scientist, so I know. But to care about climate change, we don't have to be a certain type of person. I'm absolutely convinced that just about every single person has every reason they need to care about climate change already. And their reason might be different than yours or mine. But if we don't think we care about climate change, it's not because we have to change who we are or what we care about. It's simply because we have not connected the dots between what we already care about and how climate change is affecting it. So when we have these conversations starting over something that we share, whether it's a love of cooking or a sport or the place where we live or our child, we connect the dots between climate change and how it's affecting what we already care about, what already matters to us. And then we talk about how we really can fix this thing. And in fact, climate change is not a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of a very steep hill with only a few hands on it. That giant boulder is already at the top of the hill. It's already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has millions of hands on it. It just needs more hands to get it going faster. When we realize that we are not alone, when we realize that the world truly can change, that's when we realize that yes, we truly can make a difference. And how do we knock over that first domino? By having a simple conversation about why climate change matters and what we can all do to help fix it.
Yeah, so she's a very entertaining and very personable and motivating speaker. We actually had her at one of our, I think it was the Earth Day event. And I know she's been coming out to, well, I guess virtually coming to Toronto to do presentations as well. So let me just continue. So there are some things that you can do. And one of the programs at Climate Fast, the organization I belong to, it's called Kitchen Table Climate Conversations. And we will support you through actually having a conversation with your family and friends and actually doing a webcast if that's what you'd like to do, like a Zoom session to talk to people. Though I guess now it's a bit, the risk is lessened, at least here in Toronto, and I understand in Calgary as well, because we're kind of returning more to in-person events now, in-person meetings. So that's one of the links that you could take a look at, Kitchen Table Climate Conversations. And the other one is a program called Carbon Conversations Toronto. And I think they were doing it virtually, and they may still be doing it virtually. But I guess if it's in person, it'll be a bit of a stretch to come from Calgary to Toronto to participate in that. But you can always take a look at their website. And next is Right Personal Action. So these are some of the websites, links that you can take a look at if you would like to reduce your personal carbon footprint. There's actually a very good video that is in this list from Just Have a Think Again that talks about what you can do. So there's things like if you're replacing an old natural gas furnace with an electric heat pump, one of the things you can do, replacing a gas range with an electric induction one, replacing your propane barbecue or natural gas fireplace and replacing it with an electric one. Again, basically electrifying anything that's burning, fossil fuels, gasoline or natural gas. Things like walking more, biking, taking public transit, flying less. Flying uses up a lot of carbon. Eating more sustainably, eating less meat, more fruits, vegetables, wasting less food. If it goes to landfill, it actually decays and produces methane. Wasting less water, electricity, buying less, buying what you need. Actually, I'm going to talk about that more. So this is a slide that I just added, and I'm not sure if people can read it, but you can see the graphic how the airplanes and cars, as opposed to buses and trains, give you an idea of the carbon footprint depending on different transportation options that you can take. And these are in terms of carbon costs per kilometer. So the airplane one, which has, and I have difficulty reading it, I think it's 257 if I can read it correctly, that's per kilometer. So if you're taking a flight that's 1,000 kilometers, that's how much carbon you're actually emitting. So the next one was to talk about waste. Waste is a big problem. So if it's compost waste and it goes into landfill, it decays and it produces methane. And there's plastic waste that's been an ongoing problem. This is just a graphic of some of the plastic facts, and probably a little bit too small to read, but you can go to these websites and you can take a look at that. And the next slide was this one. And again, it's a little bit small, but you can go to this website and it's talks about the carbon footprint of everything. And in this graphic, it talks about the carbon footprint of different foods. And basically, if it's anything related to animals, like meat, even poultry, pork, then it's going to have a larger carbon footprint as opposed to vegetables like legumes. So next I wanted to talk about financial action, taking financial action. So this is the Dirty Dozen. This is from the 2022 Banking on Climate Chaos Report. It's produced by the Rainforest Action Network, Bank Trank, and a number of other environmental organizations. Royal Bank is the number 5 fossil fuel investor in the world, with $201 billion invested since 2016. And the other big 5 banks in Canada are almost as bad. So you can take a look at that. I think the link is in the chat. So there is a program that's been started up by the Climate Pledge Collective in Toronto, and it's called Bank Switch. And they will walk you through how to switch your bank from a big 5 bank to, say, a credit union or a more climate-friendly bank financial institution. So the other one that I'm mentioning here is Shift Action. So Shift Action, if you pay into Canada Pension Plan or are getting benefits from Canada Pension Plan, it's actually what they're trying to do is promote telling your pension plan provider to divest from fossil fuels. So, and in fact, if you're I guess this more applies to Toronto and Ontario, but if you're a municipal employee in Toronto or a health worker in Ontario or a municipal employee in Ontario, they actually have some action letters that you can send to the people that look after the pension funds for those workers. So, and moving along, right, social action. So volunteer. There are so many organizations. It's mind-boggling how many organizations are out there. And it doesn't have to be just environment. Organizations that are doing social action, like trying to deal with social injustice, Indigenous injustice, racial injustice. Everything is interconnected. So you are a unique individual, and you can contribute uniquely to addressing our climate crisis. So I encourage you to join an organization. whether it deals with social injustice or preserving our forests or lobbying governments to take urgent and drastic climate action. These are a few that I've listed. I did a quick check on what's available in Alberta. These are just a couple of that I found. So you might want to take a look at those. So next, I'll talk about right political action. So Canada has committed to a 40% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. They released their first ever emissions reduction plan on March 29th. So what does a 40% reduction mean? Well, to me, it means 40% of our cars, buses, and trains need to be converted to electric vehicles. And 40% of our houses, our offices, our public buildings need to be off natural gas. And this assumes that your electricity is not generated from fossil fuels. And we've seen that some of the provinces are still depending on fossil fuels for their electricity generation. So continuing on. So what do we want to tell our elected representatives to do? So I just made a short list here, and I'll talk about each one of these. So fossil fuel subsidies. We need to end subsidies to fossil fuel companies by the federal and provincial governments. And I think I just noticed a typo there. So let me play this video.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
I like that video. So if you go to their website, and I think Denise would have put the link in the chat, it will counter any excuse that you could hear about dealing with climate change. So take a look at that. Currently, according to Environmental Defense, another NGO, the federal government is currently spending $3.3 billion in subsidies annually to the fossil fuel industry. I did a quick check, and Alberta subsidies total $1.32 billion in fiscal year 2021. And I just had to make this comment that carbon capture utilization systems are not proven scalable technologies. So we need emissions reductions now, not from technology that still hasn't been proven or hasn't been scaled to deliver on reductions. Continuing with right political action, you can ask your local government to declare a climate emergency There's a website for doing that, an organization that actually tracks these and encourages these declarations around the world. There's currently 2,104 jurisdictions and local governments that have declared a climate emergency. Vancouver was actually the first one in January 16th, 2019. Hamilton, where I'm from, declared it. Toronto, actually Climate Fast was involved in getting Toronto to declare it in 2019. And Calgary actually declared it just last year. So congratulations to Calgary on doing that. The third one, I think, was the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This, again, is a worldwide initiative. And cities, actually I should have listed them here. I don't think I have. But cities like Buenos Aires, Los Angeles, actually I think it is later on here. Anyway, this Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty has been supported by the Dalai Lama, 2,185 scientists and academics, and Fridays for Future. So here's, so here Vancouver was first city in the world to endorse the treaty. Toronto followed in 2021. Again, Climate Fast was involved in that. And that's it so far, other than the 2 districts that you see here. So you can ask your city council to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there's actually I think an action letter down here about asking your MP to do the same. So, and right. So actually I had some comments about renewable energy because I did a quick check on Alberta, but it's very windy in southern Alberta, and it's made Alberta the ideal site for the development of wind power. And over 1/3 of Alberta's land base has wind energy sources suitable for wind energy production. So that's a big plus for Alberta. Calgary is the city with the 3rd highest photovoltaic, which means solar panel potential in Canada, according to the Canadian Energy Regulator. And according to the Canadian Geothermal Energy Association, there is a geothermal resource potential of 388,000 megawatts in Alberta. So there's a lot of renewable energy potential in Alberta and in Calgary. Continuing with right political action, so the thing here is develop a smart climate action plan. And City of Toronto actually announced its first ever net zero by 2040 plan on December 15th, 2021. And again, Climate Fast was involved in that. We actually have, I think that's one of our organization's strengths, is that we have very good rapport and just working with city councilors. In fact, Mike Layton, who is the son of Jack Layton, and you may have heard of him, the NDP leader, he's actually one of the Toronto City Councillors who's been a very big supporter of climate action in the city. City of Calgary, I mentioned this to Susan, they announced their net zero strategy. It requires $87 billion. I think it's $3 billion per year for the next, does that add up? I think it's the next 30 years, I guess. Yeah, next 30 years. But that was announced on May 31st, 2022. So I think you have a very progressive mayor and a very progressive city council at this point. You've made your climate emergency declaration. You've got a net zero strategy. And it's basically just it's finding the funding for that. Same as the City of Toronto is in the same situation. These are some of the other actions you can take. You can talk or write to your city councilor, your MPP, or your MP. Deputations is actually making presentations to your city council. It's something that actually Climate Fast has some information on how you can undertake those actions. We also have information on how to write a letter to the editor, writing to your local newspaper. So these are all actions that will demonstrate to the government that you are concerned about climate change, the climate crisis, and that you want them to do something about it. I threw this in. This was my second letter to the editor that got published in the Toronto Star, but you can maybe read that afterwards. And petitions. There's petitions, a lot of petitions that have been started up or are currently underway with these organizations that actually provide petitions. Or you can create your own petition. So that's something you can look at. And continuing with right political action. Alberta has a fixed election date, and your next provincial election is on May 29th, 2023, which actually is less than a year away now. So you have that opportunity to make your voice heard about climate change. and right livelihood. So if you're doing any work that's contributing to the climate crisis or causing suffering of others, then you want to look at alternative work. I did want to mention Iron and Earth. And Iron and Earth is an organization of oil patch workers that are advocating and lobbying to transition from fossil fuel development to renewable energy development. So we actually had a speaker a couple of years ago now, I think it was pre-pandemic, who actually came from Iron and Earth to talk about what they were doing in Alberta. So it's something you can look into. And which brings us to the last spoke of the Wheel of the Dharma, which is right diligence. So start or continue to do those things that can help address our climate crisis. Do not lose hope. There's actually a term that they've created called eco-anxiety, and a lot of young people are actually experiencing that. In fact, I've even met some couples that have said, "Oh, I'm not going to have any kids because what kind of world are we bringing them into?" Which is very sad to hear that. But any action and every action you can take, no matter how small, makes a difference. And this is where I suggest, remember the second eye of Buddhism, which is impermanence. We can always change the situation. And there is a theory that it only takes 3.5% of a population to make a change happen. This is called the 3.5% rule, and it comes from Erica Chenoweth. So that's something that you can take a look at, and I think the link is in the chat. And I'm almost coming down to the end. So in closing, what is a Buddhist? A Buddhist, you want to be wise, you want to stay informed. I've given you some websites that you can take a look at for climate change information and what is taking place around the world. You need to keep learning, and you need to watch out for false solutions. And as I mentioned, I would categorize carbon capture as one of those false solutions. It just can't be done in time. We need to be compassionate. We need to practice what I call engaged Buddhism, meaning that you need to get involved. You need to do something. You need to talk to people. You need to talk to your elected representatives. And you need to use that wisdom and that compassion, and we call that loving kindness, in your conversations and in your advocacy. And you have to decide for yourself, like, how you use your time and energy and your skills and experience, and where would it have the greatest impact in helping to address the climate crisis. So that's what I'm encouraging you to do. Because unless we do something, we're headed to like a 3-degree or 4-degree temperature increase. And I just can't see how our children, our grandchildren are going to survive in a world like that. So I'll close with this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, and that we have the power to decide the destiny of our planet. And some final links. This is my email ID. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask, this is the organization I belong to, Climate Fast. And here's my website link again, which I think is probably, you've seen it probably earlier. I believe that each of us has something we can uniquely contribute to addressing our climate crisis. So please think about it. I'm hoping that my presentation has motivated you to do something further. So we're going to start with our Q&A. I'm going to stop my share. And I'm going to introduce Sharon. I think text Sharon.
Hi, everybody.
So,
just for ease, Ray, I also sent you a link in the chat so you can take a look at them if they seem a little awkward.
Okay.
Yeah, I've gathered these from the presentation from other things as well. So
Okay.
anyway, timely question because of the conflict in the Ukraine, Ray. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the fact that we hear people calling for the government to subsidize the price of gas because it's hurting people. But isn't a higher price for gasoline just what we need?
Okay. Yeah.
And how will those without money deal with the carbon price, with the price on gas?
Okay. Okay, so there's a couple of things that are mixed in with all of that. So the federal government, Canadian federal government, has actually have what they call a carbon tax or carbon levy. And it's meant to actually increase every year till 2030. And the idea was to make gasoline and burning natural gas, all the types of fossil fuels, more expensive so that people would look for alternatives. So if you were driving a gas-powered car, you'd be looking at getting an EV instead, and they have a rebate program for that as well. What the war in the Ukraine has done is accelerated that whole process, because gasoline is more expensive, natural gas is going to be more expensive everywhere. And so that's, to me, to be honest, it's one silver lining coming out of the war, if you could consider anything about the war to be a silver lining. But I know that particularly in northern communities where they totally rely on diesel for their electricity generation. So there needs to be some sort of subsidization to deal with that, because otherwise if you can't afford to have a house over, a roof over your head, if you can't afford to feed yourself, then things are too expensive. And you talk about I know there was a basic income pilot in Ontario where they were looking at providing a basic income, regardless of whether you were employed or not. So it's kind of, yes, you need to subsidize the people that can't afford, whether it's diesel for their electricity or gasoline for their car, because that's all they have. It's just something that the government has to look after that. But as far as increasing gas prices, that was the whole intent of the carbon tax, to make it more expensive so that you would look at alternatives to improve, perhaps improving public transit, getting an EV, perhaps getting an e-bike. There's those kinds of options if you can afford it, and that's the thing. But I think the whole issue around the social safety net that we have, that has to be addressed at the same time, because if people can't afford to eat, how can they afford to even buy gasoline for their vehicle? So I hope that helps to answer the question.
Thank you, Ray. Belle's actually asking if you can show the chart again that shows the cost per kilometer between an electric car and a gas car.
Okay.
Do you have a chart like that? I know you had a chart that showed the greenhouse gas.
I had a chart for that, but I'm not sure if it had. Actually, I was looking at a chart that it compared the different types of EVs and gas-powered cars, but I don't think that chart showed it.
Yeah,
the top one showed an airplane, and then
Yeah, this one.
yes, because people are always. I have an EV, and people are always telling me that an EV isn't the solution, and I like to be able to show them that it at least helps.
Okay, I can find that EV. Did you register? We have your email ID.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll find that chart, because I did come across it, and it was comparing gas-powered cars to electric powered cars. Okay. So I can find that, and I'll send it out as part of the follow-up
Thank
to this
you.
presentation.
Perfect.
Okay.
thanks, Ray. Well, maybe on the electric vehicle topic, it's obviously a major aspect of our solution, certainly for urban transportation.
Yeah.
So can you comment a bit on the mining of rare minerals? I know that that's been in the press a bit.
Yes. So I don't know if you're referring to Ontario and the Ring of Fire. Is that in particular, or is this
Well, I mean, the sources seem to be, that's an obvious source.
right? Yeah. So one of the things about the rare minerals is that China has been buying up a lot of companies and a lot of resources in this area. I think they've been kind of doing it under the radar, though some newspapers have kind of alerted the public and the government to that they're doing that right now. There's been talk about it's called the Ring of Fire in Ontario, but unless they can get agreement from the Indigenous peoples in those areas, I don't think they should be doing it. But I know they're also investigating technologies that don't require as much of the rare earth or the rare minerals that are required currently. So I know there's research taking place on that right now. So I'm hoping that answers your question.
Great. I guess another question that comes up, because you mentioned electrify everything. So
Right.
I'm thinking, in terms of household, because that's where people would be thinking.
Mhm.
So there's this concept of the embodied carbon, or what it
Right.
takes to actually build something. So can you talk a little bit about how to make that decision that I'll throw away my stove and get an
Yeah.
induction? Is there
Yeah. So there's some analyses, there's charts that talk about the embodied carbon and then the ongoing carbon usage or reduction if you're converting. So things like converting from a gas stove to electric induction stove, converting, well, of course, converting from a gas-powered car to an electric car, comparing, basically, in Ontario, it's basically natural gas heating, right? So how do you convert that to air or ground source heat pump instead? So yeah, I know the question of embodied carbon is really important but the hopefully the recovery once you put in that new whatever it is, the ongoing reduction in emissions helps to. I guess the question is, are we concerned about the cost, or are we concerned about the reduction in emissions? And you have to kind of find that balance. So to me, it really comes down to that. But yes, embodied carbon is something that has to be, talked about and measured as well. And I think there's charts on that. In fact, I'm trying to remember. I think the chart that I was thinking about actually has the embodied carbon as well as the ongoing reduction in emissions. So I'll make sure that I have that as part of what I send out with the follow-up. Embodied carbon. Okay. No, it's a good question.
So it was great news to hear that Calgary has sort of moved ahead. There are other, I know there are other cities in Alberta. Can you speak a little bit about what difference does it make if a city has declared a climate emergency, and even if it's signed the treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Is there a relationship between doing that and the action in your
Yes.
experience?
Yes. I guess you can talk about that, the chicken and egg or the horse and the cart, but making that commitment, making it to the public, making it known to other cities and other governments gives you the incentive then, or the drive to say, okay, now we have to come up with a plan. Because once you announce climate emergency, then people are expecting, well, okay, you declared an emergency, what are you going to do about it? So it just follows that the declaration, whether it's a climate emergency declaration or an endorsement of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, it has to come with something that says, okay, this is what we're going to do to support that endorsement or support that declaration. And that plan is, as I mentioned already, for Calgary, and Toronto has done the same thing. But once you have the plan, you have to make sure that the funding is there. So if the funding is not there, the plan is not going to happen, right? So I know that right now Climate Fast is very concerned that City of Toronto makes sure that they have the budget to fulfill the plan that they've come up with, like a net zero plan by 2040. Very ambitious, right? Same thing I think would apply to Calgary. And if Calgary is saying that I need 3.3 billion per year, and probably they can't do it by themselves as a city, they're going to need provincial support, federal support to make that happen. But that's where you want to talk to your elected representatives. That's where you're talking to your MP, your MPP, talking to your city councillor. That's where that becomes important. And say, we want to make this happen. We need the funding, because the plan without the money, it's just can't happen. So, but good question.
I think Sylvie was asking about whether or not there was an opportunity to send some of the info in the chat later.
Sorry, send the info in the chat.
I think it's info in the chat. Susan, do you want to?
Oh, you mean the links?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're wondering if they'll be able to get a copy of the links and stuff outside of the chat, if they'll be emailed, like in your presentation or a recording.
Oh, okay. So there are links in my presentation, which I think should be the same links that are being put into the chat. So when I send out my follow-up to all the people that have registered for this webcast, I'll be sending a copy of my presentation with the links embedded in the slides themselves. And if there are any, I'll do a double check to make sure that anything that we are putting into the chat is covered in the presentation, or I'll add it as an additional in the email that will go out with the presentation. Okay.
Great, thank you.
So I
Okay.
guess one question that I have, so I'm going to ask it. But can you suggest what a Sangha might do collectively to act on climate change, Ray? Have you had any indications of what groups have done or how that synergy can work?
Well, it's always easier to do things in a group, right? You can lobby, you can try to organize if you're doing a deputation, if you want to have a meeting with your MP, your MPP, or city councillor. It's just easier in a group, because if you go into a meeting with your city councillor, I think there's always a rule of thumb: 3 people that you have. You have somebody that's actually going to do the talking, you have somebody that's going to do the timing, and you have somebody taking notes of the conversation, right? So those 3 things, because if a politician's time is very important, they say, I've only got, 30 minutes to talk to you. You want to make sure you use that time up wisely. So it's always just easier in a group. And I think your MP or MPP or city councilor is going to be more impressed. I have a group of 20 people. I represent an organization of 50 people, right? I want to have this dialogue with you. So it makes it more important to the politician that you're dealing with when they know that you're dealing with an organization that represents a number of people, as opposed to just you're by yourself. So.
And I guess that could go for when you're writing as well. You could write as a group if you can get that kind of agreement from the organization.
Sure. Yeah. Well, when you do an endorsement, when you do an endorsement or you do a declaration, if you declare as an organization and it's a known organization, a well-known organization, then it just has more power when you're talking to politicians. So they're interested in votes, right? So the more people you have behind you saying, we want this to happen, we want you to do this, then that's where the politicians will perk up and listen, because it's not just you by yourself. Like, hey, I'm a person representing 50 people. So
one of the things that came to mind just suddenly, because we've just come out of an election, is it may also be appropriate for a group or individuals to send letters of appreciation or notes of appreciation for things that are good. Like, for example, in the case of Calgary, I don't know if people have had an opportunity to thank the city for doing what it did,
Yep.
but it pays off as well in terms of future sympathy with the questions and challenges that you'll inevitably make.
Yeah. No, if Calgary Buddhist Temple wanted to send a letter to the mayor, the new mayor, or their city council, to say that congratulations on coming out with this plan. Now let's make sure that we get the funding to make it happen, right? I know I sent thank you emails to the city councilor, Mike Layton, Shelley Carroll, thanking them for pushing through our, first they declared a climate emergency, then they endorsed the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, then they came out with net zero by 2040. So every one of those things deserves, hey, thanks for doing a great job and addressing my concern, right? So if you can do that for your Calgary city council and mayor, sure, it makes sense. And it helps you to establish a dialogue with them, that when the next thing comes up, oh, you need funding? Okay, let me see what I can do to get my constituents, my membership, to help support that.
So Ray, actually, maybe we could open it up to any other questions that people have.
I can go to gallery view if that helps. And this is where you can actually just raise your hand, or you can raise your hand through the icon, I think, too, right? Let me just remove my spotlight and Sharon's spotlight. Okay.
The reactions button will let you raise a
Yeah.
hand if you're using
Yeah. So on mine, if you go to reactions, you can raise your hand. You can ask your question verbally, or if you want to raise your hand because you have your video on, you can do the same thing. So any other questions people would like to ask? Or you can just put something in the chat if you prefer to do that instead. Maybe I can ask people, do you feel, has the presentation helped, and do you feel motivated to actually want to do something about climate change? Susan, I'm looking at you. You're muted.
There, sorry. I was thinking though, why do you think climate change doesn't get the exposure or it's so important, but you don't hear about it that much. I guess it's not like a war in the Ukraine and something that's happening immediately, like
Right.
a flood or,
Yeah. Well, there's some reason I mentioned about sponsorship and advertising, but in 2019, the fall of 2019, we had 10,000 people show up at Queen's Park in Toronto, right? And then right after that, the pandemic hit, and that was front page news. So that whole momentum that we had at that point with 10,000 people showing up in Queen's Park, and then, like, the Queen's Park Circle was just filled with people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pandemic, climate change went, well, not to the bottom, but became a lesser concern. And I think, now it was Afghanistan at one point, then it was war, now it's the war in Ukraine, right? So things that are, disastrous, human suffering, that makes front page news, right? Climate change is kind of this gradual, I don't know if you heard about the frog in the water, the temperature gets turned up gradually, doesn't realize I'm actually going to be boiled to death, but that's what climate change is like. And if there weren't these other disasters right now, like the pandemic or the war in the Ukraine or anything else, then you would hear about these heat waves in India and Pakistan, right? Like 45 degrees, like every day. Like, how do you survive, right? And then if you don't have power, you can't turn on your AC. In Canada, we are a wealthy country. We can withstand some of these things that are happening, right? But when the flooding comes back to British Columbia, or the wildfires come back, or the heat dome comes back, what are they going to do, right? And the more we burn fossil fuels, we're just making it worse, right? And if you're using fossil fuels to produce your electricity, and you're turning your AC on to combat the heat wave that you're trying to deal with, it's called a spiral. All you're doing is you're spiraling into a worse and worse situation. So you need to realize that you're in this spiral and you need to stop it, right? And it means, and I know in Alberta they talk about reducing the amount of emissions from extracting their oil and gas, right? But that oil and gas that's being produced gets shipped off to other countries. They burn it there, and it's all the same atmosphere. So that CO2 is still going into the atmosphere, right? Anyways, Val, you have a question?
Sorry, more a comment. Just to say that I used to be involved with Extinction Rebellion in Calgary, and the COVID-19 did us in. It was beginning to be a growing group, right. Lots of activities, lots of awareness, and it just died with COVID-19. But your talk has re-inspired me. So thank you for that.
Great. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I know that Extinction Rebellion, we call it XR. We actually had an XR group in Toronto, and I think they're restarting, Sharon. No, maybe not.
I think they were, but there actually hasn't been any action that I'm aware of recently.
Yeah. So that's kind of, to me, it's like Plan X. Like, it's the last resort where you actually have to practice mass civil disobedience in order to get your point across. But I don't know. We'll have to see how the new Ontario provincial Conservative government is going to be. But if it's anything like the last one, which really their plan is no plan, then we'll see with that. If we have to pull XR out of the hat. So I hope not. I know that in England right now, XR does not have a very good reputation because some of their actions are hurting a lot of people. But I think if you use it wisely and use it targeting specifically, then you might be able to accomplish something with it. But to me, it's a last resort. Like, that's the last thing you want to have to do. But we'll see. We'll see how the new Ontario government responds to what we're asking them. So it's still kind of there's a lot of disappointment with the environmental groups in Ontario right now because of what happened. Like, instead of the 67 seats that they had previously, or 68 seats that they had previously, they have now 81 seats. Like, it's even worse than before. So anyway, any other questions? Anything in the chat, Sharon? I haven't seen anything.
No, there isn't. I think we've covered
Okay.
it.
Okay, so I will send a copy of the slides, and as I said, the links are embedded in the slides, so you'll get a copy of that. And I will double check to make sure that whatever we put into the chat, there is a link somewhere, either in the slides themselves or in my covering email that I'll send out. If you did not register and you're in this event because you received the link from someone else, please put your email ID in the chat, because I can only go by the email IDs that in the Eventbrite registration process. So, but I will send out a copy of the slides. This webcast has been recorded, so I need to do some editing, but I wasn't planning on sending the video out unless people would like to receive that as well. But it's something that I was going to make available to Susan in case she wanted to use that. So
I've actually had a couple of people that have texted as well as emailed me asking for the recording because they couldn't make it. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll make that available. I'll just have to do some editing on that. Other than that, Susan, anything else that you wanted to wrap up?
Maybe I'll just do some closing words then. Sure. On behalf of the Calgary Buddhist Temple, I'd like to thank Ray for a truly engaging, thought-provoking presentation, as well as we're very grateful for his tech team of Sharon and Denise. Thank you very much, ladies. Appreciate your time. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the great participants who joined today. We hope you found today's presentation enlightening, and perhaps it also will inspire you to think or rethink about your actions for the coming generations. So our Sangha engagement will be taking a break now until September. We'll be back September 11th, where we'll be fortunate to have Ray back with us. He's going to be doing an online introduction to mindful meditation, not mediation, like I accidentally misspelt it. Sorry. Mindful meditation. So we look forward to seeing you again soon, Ray. Registration information for that presentation will be available shortly on our website, in our newsletter, and on Facebook as well. So now, before we part and end today's presentation, can I please have everyone put their hands together in appreciation for this opportunity to engage with each other and share this very important information. So I'll lead us in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and for Ray. It's been wonderful to spend this time together with everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Good afternoon.
Susan. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Denise.
Thanks very much, Ray.
Okay, you're welcome, Don.
Take care.
Yeah. Bye, Mise, Lori, and Cody, and Masaye.